A woman returns home to mourn her father and stumbles upon a strange incident in the case of her younger brother, who disappeared 27 years ago. Little does she know that her hometown is buried with secrets and sins, not just of one person. Grief was not a dull ache or a slow, steady weight pressing on her chest. It was sharp, an unbearable, suffocating thing that clawed at her from the inside, a relentless reminder that she was alone. Utterly, irreversibly alone. Natalie Carter sat on the edge of her father's bed, the sheets still carrying his scent, and let the weight of it settle over her. First, her mother, 5 years ago, after a long battle with illness. Now her father, his body barely cold in the ground. And before them, Ethan, her little brother, stolen from the world at 12 years old, leaving nothing behind but an unsolved case and a family that unraveled in his absence. Now there was no one left. The house was hers, but it didn't feel like home. It was a tomb, filled with ghosts, whispers of laughter in the hallway, the scrape of her father's chair against the kitchen tile, the echo of her mother's voice calling them in for dinner. She could almost hear Ethan's sneakers slapping against the hardwood, could almost see him grinning at her, teasing her like he used to. But the house was silent now. Natalie stood, forcing herself to move, because standing still meant remembering, and remembering felt dangerous. She walked through the house slowly, fingers trailing over dusty picture frames, the wood worn smooth from years of touch. The wake had ended hours ago, but traces of it lingered. Cold coffee cups on the counter, the faint scent of fading perfume from old neighbors who had come, whispered their condolences and left as quickly as they could. No one wanted to talk about Ethan. No one ever did. She had hated that as a child, the way people pretended he had never existed. At 12, she had wanted to scream at them, forcing them to say his name. But time had buried Ethan deeper than any grave could. He wasn't just missing, he had been erased. She wandered into her father's study, seeking what exactly? Comfort. Answers. Maybe just something to anchor her to him, to keep the grief from hollowing her out completely. The room was untouched, a time capsule of his quiet, methodical life. His desk was still covered in neatly stacked papers, a row of pens lined up in perfect order. She had always found his precision infuriating as a child. Now it felt like a kind of safety, a reminder that he had been real. Her fingers grazed the spines of old books before stopping on a dusty leather album tucked into the corner of the shelf. Her breath hitched. She knew this album, family photos. A tremor ran through her fingers as she pulled it down, the leather cool and cracked beneath her touch. She carried it to the desk, swallowing the lump in her throat as she flipped through the first few pages. Pictures of birthdays, summer trips, and Christmas mornings. Then, June 1995. Her pulse slowed. The last photos of Ethan before he vanished. Her father had taken them, the morning he disappeared. She had seen these before, had studied them, memorized them, traced Ethan's smile with her fingertips more times than she could count. But as she turned the page, something stopped her cold. One picture, Ethan, Tommy and Lucas, standing with their bikes on the dirt path leading toward the woods. The morning light cast long shadows. The photo was taken by their father, and she remembered his enthusiasm for capturing the beautiful moments for everyone around him. It seemed like it was just yesterday. The children stood there, waving happily before leaving. Natalie reminded herself not to cry anymore, before her eyes would fall out from crying so much. But when looking closely at the photo in the side mirror of a parked car, a reflection, a man standing just beyond the tree line, watching them. That gaze seemed to be waiting for prey, even though the figure was faint. Natalie's skin went cold. She leaned in, squinting, her heart hammering. The figure was blurry, almost indistinct, but the posture, the way he stood, rigid and waiting. She flipped the page, looking for more photos from that day, but there were no others. Who was he? Her father had never mentioned anyone else being there. The case files she had read, nothing about a man at the scene. She stood abruptly, heart racing. The police report. She needed to see it again. She dug through the boxes she had pulled from her father's closet, hands shaking as she pulled out a battered manila folder. The pages were yellowed with age, brittle at the corners, but she read through them carefully. Nothing. No mention of a witness. No mention of a parked car. It was as if he had never existed. She clenched the photo in her hand. Something had been erased. Something had been covered up. She had spent 27 years mourning Ethan, screaming into the silence, demanding answers no one would give her. But now she had proof that something had been missed, or worse, hidden. Her grip on the album tightened. For the first time in years, she felt something stronger than grief. She felt resolve. The town felt smaller than she remembered. Sturgeon had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you even had a chance to live it. But time had worn it down, pressing it into something even more insular, more cautious. The roads looked narrower, the storefronts older, their signs faded by Michigan's relentless winters. Even the air felt different, still, stagnant, like the town had been holding its breath for nearly 3 decades. Natalie walked slowly down Main Street, hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching people watch her. They recognized her. Of course they did. She had seen it at the funeral, the sidelong glances, the hushed murmurs. That's Natalie Carter, the sister. No one ever said Ethan's name out loud. She passed Miller's Gas and Convenience, its rusted fuel pumps standing like relics from another time. A teenage boy inside rang up a sale without looking up, a half-hearted ding from the register echoing into the street as an old man shuffled past her with a carton of milk. The grocery store was just ahead, its windows clouded with dust, the hand-painted Downing's Market sign swaying slightly in the breeze. She pushed the door open, the scent of old wood and dried herbs greeting her. Mrs. Downing stood behind the counter, counting bills with the same meticulous care Natalie remembered from childhood. Her hair had gone entirely white. Her frame was thinner, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Natalie Carter," she said, without looking up. Natalie hesitated, fingers brushing against the cool metal of a shopping cart, before deciding she didn't need one. "Hi, Mrs. Downing. I was just passing through." The old woman nodded, but her hands slowed on the cash. "Heard about your father. I'm sorry." "Thank you." A pause. He loved this town." Mrs. Downing exhaled through her nose. "So did your mother. So did Ethan." There it was. Natalie swallowed. "Do you remember much about that summer? When Ethan—" The air shifted, just slightly. Mrs. Downing's shoulders stiffened. The steady rhythm of her counting stopped altogether. She pressed the bills together and tucked them into the register with a quiet finality. "Some things," she said without looking up, "are better left alone." Natalie's throat tightened. "You were here when it happened. You must remember." "I remember everything, dear." The older woman met her eyes then, voice steady but thin. "But I also remember what happens when people start asking the wrong questions." A silence stretched between them, thick and unmoving. Then, as if nothing had happened, Mrs. Downing turned, lifting a crate of apples onto the counter. The conversation was over. The police station hadn't changed much either. Same beige walls, same squeaky linoleum floors. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, squinting at her name on the visitor log. "You said Carter." "Yes." Natalie pulled her coat tighter around herself. "I need to look at some old case files." The woman frowned. "What case?" Natalie hesitated. "Ethan Carter, my brother." The air changed again, the same way it had in the store. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. "Hold on." She disappeared into the back office, leaving Natalie standing alone, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. A few minutes later, a bored-looking deputy emerged, holding a thin manila folder. Too thin. "Sorry," he said, dropping it onto the counter. "Not much left." Natalie flipped through the pages, her stomach twisting. Half the documents were missing. Witness statements gone. Autopsy reports, never conducted. She scanned the last remaining report, her pulse spiking at a name. Raymond Holloway, lead investigator, case closed, 1995. Raymond Holloway's house sat at the edge of town, hidden behind tall trees and an overgrown yard, its windows clouded with grime. The once respected detective had vanished from public life after Ethan's case was closed. Some said he'd left town, others whispered he'd drunk himself into obscurity, but Natalie had found his address easily enough, almost too easily, as if the town hadn't even tried to hide it. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open just an inch, just enough for her to see a single bloodshot eye staring back at her. "Go away." Natalie's breath hitched. "Mr. Holloway, my name is... I know who you are." His voice was rough, thick with whiskey and thyme. "I need to talk to you about Ethan." The door slammed shut. She stepped back, stunned, staring at the peeling paint, at the way his hands had trembled just before the door closed. But it wasn't anger she'd seen in those eyes. It was guilt. The smell of old cigarettes and spilled beer clung to the walls of Miller's Tavern, a dimly lit bar at the far end of town. The neon sign outside buzzed, flickering between letters, as if it too had grown weary of this place. Natalie hesitated at the entrance. She had never stepped foot in here before, not even as a teenager sneaking glances at the town's rougher edges. Her father would have hated the thought of her here. But Jack Monroe hadn't exactly left her with options. She spotted him immediately. A man slouched in the farthest booth, shoulders curved inward, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. His hair, once neatly combed in his newspaper column photo, had grown wild and uneven. He looked hollowed out, as if whatever fight he'd once had long since burned away. Natalie made her way over, her boots sticking slightly to the worn-out floorboards. "You're Jack Monroe?" He didn't look up. "If you're selling something, I'm not interested." "I'm not selling anything." She pulled out the photo from her father's album, sliding it across the table. "I need answers." That got his attention. Jack glanced at the picture, then at her. His eyes sharpened, recognition, hesitation, something close to resentment flickered through them. "You're Carter's girl." "Yes, I'm Natalie." Jack exhaled, rubbing his face. "Hell of a time to bring this up, don't you think?" He gestured around them, as if the flickering beer signs and aging drunks made the conversation inappropriate. "I didn't come here for small talk," she said. Jack rolled his eyes, but she caught it, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers tapped against the rim of his glass. He was uncomfortable. She pressed. "You wrote about my brother's case, then your article disappeared. Why?" Jack gave a dry chuckle. "Because this town has a long memory, Carter." He took another sip of whiskey. And an even longer silence. Natalie folded her arms. "That's not an answer." He sighed, drumming his fingers against the glass. The silence stretched between them before he finally spoke again, his voice lower now. "I had sources," he admitted. "People who told me the investigation wasn't handled right, witnesses who weren't questioned, statements that didn't match up. But the moment I started digging too deep, my editor got a call from someone who made it very clear. Either I shut up or I lost my job." "And you just gave up?" Jack scoffed. "You think I had a choice?" He leaned forward, eyes dark. "I got threats, Carter, not just polite ones either. Someone trashed my car, broke my front window, and when that didn't work, I got a letter in my mailbox saying if I didn't stop asking questions, I might end up taking a little trip myself." Natalie's stomach tightened. "You think someone in the town was involved?" Jack let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I don't think. I know." She studied him, the way his fingers gripped the glass just a little too tightly, the way his eyes darted toward the door like he was expecting someone to walk in at any moment. He still carried the fear with him, even after all these years. Natalie placed her hands flat on the table. "I found this picture in my father's things." Jack barely glanced at it. "Look again." She pointed to the reflection in the car mirror. Jack's eyes flicked downward, and then he froze. The color drained from his face. He grabbed the picture, bringing it closer to the dim overhead light. His lips parted slightly, his breath hitching just enough for her to notice. "Where did you say you got this?" "My father took it, the morning Ethan disappeared." Jack didn't speak right away. He was staring at the reflection in the mirror, the shadowy figure partially obscured by glare. "This isn't just some stranger," he murmured. Natalie's pulse spiked. "Who is it?" Jack hesitated, rubbing his jaw. "I don't know for sure, but I can tell you one thing. This man, he wasn't in the official police reports." A cold weight settled in Natalie's chest. That was exactly what she had feared. Jack let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Jesus. He sat back, rubbing his temples like the memory of it all had crept back up his spine. For the first time he looked at her differently. Not as an annoyance, not as another Carter stirring up the past, but as someone who was just as tangled in this mess as he was. "Are you really sure you want to do this?" Jack asked finally, voice quieter, more careful. Natalie didn't hesitate. "Yes." Jack nodded slowly, as if making peace with something in his head. He finished his drink in one sharp swallow, then pushed the glass aside. "All right." He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "If we do this, we do it right. No half measures, no assumptions." Natalie's heart pounded. Jack Monroe, once silenced, once forced to turn his back on the truth, had just agreed to help her. For the first time in 27 years, someone was finally willing to talk. The library smelled of dust and aging paper, the kind of place where time settled in the corners, untouched and undisturbed. Jack had insisted on coming at night. "Less eyes," he had said. "Less ears." Natalie didn't argue. The archives were tucked away in a basement room, accessible only by an old key Jack had borrowed from a friend. The overhead light flickered as they stepped inside, casting long shadows across the rows of metal filing cabinets and wooden shelves buckling under decades of forgotten records. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "All right, let's see what they didn't want me to find." Natalie hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, her fingers grazing the spines of yellowed newspapers. Each page held the weight of a town that had long since decided to forget. She found the summer of '95, flipping through headlines that felt almost absurd in their detachment. Local fair sees record attendance. Council approves new stoplight on Main. Carter boy still missing. Investigation ongoing. That was it. No follow-ups, no urgency. Just one brief article before the case faded into the background. Jack muttered a curse under his breath. They scrubbed it. Natalie looked up. "What?" "My original article." He tapped the thin stack of pages in front of him. "I wrote a whole damn series on Ethan's disappearance. Every lead, every inconsistency, every gap in the official story. It should be here." He tossed a newspaper aside. "But it's not." She swallowed hard. "They erased it." Jack's jaw tightened. "Not just me." He held up another article, this one barely legible from overexposure to light, a sign of intentional fading. "Look at this. It's a quote from one of the witnesses, some guy who saw a car near the woods that morning." Natalie leaned in. "What happened to him?" Jack frowned. "No idea. His statement isn't in the police reports." Her fingers brushed over the ink, over words that should have meant something, but were now little more than whispers in a void. And then she saw it. A name. Ed Grayson. The drive to Ed's cabin was long, the trees lining the road gnarled and bare, reaching toward them like something out of a nightmare. Jack gripped the wheel tighter. I interviewed him once. Briefly. Natalie turned to him. And? Jack let out a humorless chuckle. He told me a story about a truck. A blue pickup parked near the trail that day. Said he saw someone sitting inside, just waiting. Natalie felt the hairs on her arms rise. And no one followed up? Jack shook his head. Cops ignored it. Said he was old, half senile. He glanced at her. The thing is, I believed him. The cabin emerged from the trees like a forgotten relic, its wooden frame dark with rot, the porch sagging under years of neglect. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, but otherwise, it looked abandoned. Natalie and Jack stepped out of the car. Jack knocked once, then twice. A long pause. Then, the slow creak of wood as the door cracked open. Ed Grayson was thinner than she expected. His beard wild, eyes sharp, despite the weathered lines cutting through his face. He stared at them for a moment, before finally speaking. I wondered when someone would come back asking about that truck. Natalie stiffened. You remember? Ed let out a short laugh. I never forgot. Inside, the cabin was cluttered but warm, the scent of burning wood mingling with something older, something like dust and time. Ed leaned back in his chair, watching them carefully. You want to know about that day? Natalie nodded. Ed sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I was out near the trail early that morning, checking for storm damage, and I saw it, an old blue pickup, parked just past the tree line. Jack leaned forward. Did you see who was driving it? Ed hesitated. Then, finally, yeah, I did. The silence that followed felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. Natalie's heart pounded. Who was it? Ed met her gaze, his voice quieter now. Daniel Brooks. She barely heard Jack curse under his breath. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Daniel Brooks, the former police chief's brother. The man whose record had been wiped clean more times than anyone could count. Ed's fingers tapped against the arm of his chair. I told the cops. Told them exactly what I saw. You know what they told me? Jack answered for him. To forget it. Ed nodded slowly. The fire crackled between them, but Natalie barely noticed. Daniel Brooks. This wasn't just an accident. It had never been an accident. Natalie hadn't thought about that day in years. The image had been buried under layers of grief, tucked away in a place she rarely let herself visit. But now, sitting in Jack's car with Ed Grayson's words still ringing in her ears, the memory slammed into her with full force. William Brooks had been in their living room. She was 13, curled up in the corner of the couch, watching as her mother sobbed into a crumpled tissue. Her father sat stiffly beside her, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. And there was William, the town's respected police chief, standing in front of them, offering the kind of empty words people give when they don't know what else to say. A terrible accident, he had said. We're doing everything we can, but... He never finished the sentence. Her mother had nodded, desperate to believe him. Her father had shaken his hand, voice hoarse, as he thanked him for all the hard work. Natalie had sat there, staring at the man who was supposed to be the town's protector, the man her parents trusted. And she had believed him too. But he had lied. His brother was here. Back in the present, Jack's voice cut through the silence. Are you okay? Natalie blinked, the memory dissolving like mist. She realized she had been gripping her seatbelt, fingers numb from the pressure. She forced a nod. Just thinking. Jack didn't push. Instead, he drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. If Daniel Brooks was there that day, we need to find out why. Natalie exhaled slowly. We start with his history. Jack's apartment was cluttered with half-opened notebooks, scattered newspaper clippings, and an overflowing ashtray despite the fact that he didn't smoke anymore. He had once been a damn good journalist, and even though the town had tried to erase his work, the evidence of his obsession remained in stacks and folders, tucked into every available surface. He booted up his laptop, tapping in Daniel Brooks's name. A few mugshots appeared, grainy but unmistakable. Jesus, Jack muttered, multiple assault charges, but no convictions. Natalie leaned in. How is that possible? Jack clicked through the files. Because every charge was dropped, some cases never even made it to court. He scrolled further. Victims refused to testify, witnesses recanted, and look at this, all of it happened while William Brooks was police chief. Natalie's stomach turned. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. He was protected, every single time. She thought of Ed's story, the blue pickup truck. The man is waiting in the woods. Jack's voice was low. Ray Holloway is going to love this. They found Ray Holloway in the same place as before, behind his locked door, whiskey thick on his breath. Jack knocked harder this time. The door cracked open an inch. Ray's bloodshot eyes narrowed when he saw them. I told you. Jack didn't wait. He shoved a printout of Daniel's mugshot through the gap. Ray's expression shifted instantly. He stared at the paper like it was something rotten. His fingers trembled before he snatched it away, eyes flicking up to meet Natalie's. I knew it, he muttered. Natalie's pulse spiked. You suspected him? Ray hesitated, then let the door swing open wider. Get in. The inside of Ray's house was stale and cluttered, a space where time had stopped moving. A dusty TV played a rerun of an old crime show, the volume so low it was barely a murmur. Ray slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. I knew Daniel was trouble. I knew it for years. Then why didn't you do anything? Jack's voice was sharp, edged with frustration. Ray let out a bitter laugh. You think I didn't try? You don't know how things worked back then. He tossed the mugshot onto the table. William wouldn't let us near his brother. Any time we brought up Daniel in an investigation, the reports got buried. Witnesses stopped talking. He shook his head. It didn't take long before people just stopped trying. Natalie gritted her teeth. You stopped trying. Ray flinched but didn't deny it. She took a breath. Ed Grayson saw Daniel's truck at the scene that day. Ray's head snapped up. Jack folded his arms. That's why we're here. We need everything you've got on Daniel. We're not letting this die like last time. Ray exhaled slowly. I don't have much left, but I do remember one thing. They waited. Ray leaned forward. In the summer of '95, Daniel was drowning in gambling debt. Owed money to people he couldn't afford to piss off. Natalie's skin prickled. Who? Ray shrugged. A lot of guys ran bets back then, but the ones Daniel owed, they weren't the kind of people who let debts go unpaid. Jack grabbed his phone. I know someone who might know more. He stepped into the next room, already dialing. Ray's gaze settled on Natalie. You really think you can fix this? His voice was quieter now. Natalie met his eyes. I don't know, but I have to try. Jack came back a few minutes later, his expression dark. Well? Natalie asked. Jack let out a slow breath. I called an old source from the casinos. He remembers Daniel from back in the day. Says he was desperate that summer, talking about a way to make quick money. Ray muttered a curse. That's not good. Natalie frowned. Quick money? How? Jack hesitated. He wouldn't say, just that whatever it was, it involved people who don't forgive debts. A heavy silence settled over the room. Natalie knew what they were all thinking. The easiest money in the world wasn't a bet. It was a deal, a trade. She swallowed hard. You think Daniel? Jack didn't let her finish. We need to find him. The first call came at 2:17 a.m. Natalie woke with a sharp inhale, the kind where your body senses something is wrong before your mind catches up. The motel room was dark, the glow from the street lamp outside casting long shadows through the thin curtains. The phone on the nightstand buzzed again. Unknown number. She let it ring. Then, silence. Then, a voicemail. Her pulse was heavy in her throat as she sat up, flipping the phone over in her hands before pressing play. At first, there was nothing. Just dead air, the kind of static that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Then, a voice, low, distorted, like it had been run through an old tape recorder. "You don't want to do this." Natalie's breath caught. The voice continued. "Let sleeping dogs lie, Miss Carter. You're digging up things meant to stay buried." The line cut out. She sat there, gripping the phone so tightly her fingers ached. The motel room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. A sound outside made her jump. Footsteps. She moved quietly to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. A figure stood near the motel parking lot, too far to see clearly, but close enough that she knew they were looking at her. Then, as if sensing her gaze, the person turned and slipped into the darkness. Jack was already awake when she banged on his door. He answered, shirt half-buttoned, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. His expression shifted when he saw her face. What happened? Natalie shoved the phone into his hand, voice steady, despite the tremor in her fingers. Voicemail. Jack pressed play, and she watched as his jaw tightened, his fingers clenching slightly at his side. When it ended, he exhaled through his nose. Christ. It means we're getting close, Natalie said. Jack studied her for a second, then gave a slow nod. Yeah, it does. They didn't realize how close until Jack got attacked. It was just after midnight when it happened. Natalie had stepped out to grab coffee from the vending machine down the hall. When she returned, the motel door was slightly ajar. Her stomach dropped. Jack. No answer. She pushed the door open, and the sight knocked the breath from her lungs. Jack was slumped against the dresser, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, his notepad missing from the table. The motel lamp had been knocked over, its dim glow flickering as if it too was struggling to stay awake. Jack groaned, lifting a hand to his head. Jesus! Natalie dropped beside him. Who did this? He exhaled shakily. Didn't see. His voice was hoarse, like he'd had the wind knocked out of him. Door opened. Thought it was you. Next thing I knew, I was on the floor. She gritted her teeth. They were running out of time. They needed to move. Ray Holloway met them at the trailhead near the lake. The sky had darkened, storm clouds rolling in like a warning. The air smelled of rain, damp earth, and something older, something unsettled. This is a mistake, Ray muttered, lighting a cigarette. It's been almost 30 years. You think you're going to find something no one else did. Jack wiped dried blood from his temple. You want to go back to drinking yourself to death, or do you want to help us? Ray took a slow drag. Fine. But I'm telling you now, you don't want to see what you're looking for. They hiked deep into the woods, the path overgrown and forgotten. The rain of these few days will wash away everything. The evil things that people want to hide will be exposed by God and save kindness and truth. Then Natalie saw it. It was so familiar, as if it had been in the Carter family's dreams for nearly 30 years. The color of the shirt Ethan wore that day. The ground near the tree line was uneven, like something had been disturbed. Her pulse hammered as she stepped closer. I think this is it, she whispered. Jack exhaled, dropping to his knees. He started digging, bare hands, wet soil seeping under his nails. Then, something caught. Fabric. Natalie sucked in a breath as Jack carefully pulled it free. Torn, stained, unmistakable. It was a shirt, Ethan's shirt, and it was covered in dried blood. The storm broke overhead, thunder rolling through the trees. But Natalie barely heard it. Her whole world had just come undone. Leave a comment, cheese if you're not a skimmer. Natalie collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged, her fingers digging into the damp earth as though she could hold herself together through sheer force of will. But it was impossible. Everything had unraveled. Ethan had been here. He had bled into this ground. He had never left these woods alive. Her shoulders shook as a deep, aching sob tore through her, the kind that came from years of grief, sharpened into something unbearable. The wind howled through the trees, rain starting to spit from the dark sky above, as if the earth itself was mourning with her. Jack hesitated before stepping closer, his voice low, careful. "Natalie." She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "No." Her breath came in broken gasps. "I should have." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to keep speaking. "I should have looked sooner. I should have found this before my parents died." Jack knelt beside her, his eyes dark with something that wasn't quite pity, just understanding. Natalie's voice was raw. They spent their whole lives waiting for answers that never came. And now, she let out a sharp, bitter breath. Now, they're gone. And Ethan is... Her gaze dropped to the torn fabric in Jack's hands, the blood, Ethan's blood, staining the worn material. "I was supposed to protect him," she whispered. "I was his big sister. I promised." The weight of it crushed her. All those years wasted. The birthdays Ethan never got to celebrate. The nights her mother had cried herself to sleep, hoping that maybe, her son was still out there somewhere. Her father, sitting in his old chair, staring at the wall, silently drowning in his own helplessness. Jack exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his hair. He looked away for a moment, as if giving her space to break. Then, carefully, he set the shirt down, resting it gently on the disturbed ground. "This wasn't your fault," he said, his voice quieter now. "None of it was." Natalie let out a ragged laugh, sharp and humorless. Then whose was it? Silence settled over them. Ray, who had been standing a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably. He had seen crime scenes before. He had seen grieving families before. But this wasn't some stranger's loss. It was a wound this town had buried and never bothered to unearth. Ray sighed, taking a long drag of his cigarette before flicking it into the wet soil. His voice came out rough. "You're not the only one who should have done more." Natalie turned to him, something raw flashing in her eyes. Ray didn't look at her. His gaze stayed on the fabric in the dirt, like he couldn't bring himself to meet her stare. "I was a cop back then. I should have pushed harder, should have fought back." His fingers twitched at his side, but he didn't move. "But William Brooks ran this town. We all knew it." Natalie swallowed hard. "And you let him." Ray didn't argue. He didn't need to. Jack stood, rubbing his jaw, his expression hard. "We still don't know what happened to Tommy and Lucas." Natalie flinched. The other two boys. God! She had almost forgotten. Jack's voice was careful now. "We need to get this tested. If the blood matches Ethan, the sheriff has to reopen the case." Natalie wiped at her face, her fingers trembling as she forced herself to stand. The ground felt unsteady beneath her, like the weight of it all was too much for her legs to hold. But she nodded. She had no choice but to keep going. They took the fabric straight to a forensic specialist in the next county over, not Sturgeon's lab. No one here could be trusted. The wait was agonizing. Every hour that passed felt like a century. Natalie sat with her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on the door, as if she could will it to open faster. Jack paced. Ray chain-smoked outside, his phone buzzing every so often with messages from someone neither of them asked about. Then, finally, the forensic tech stepped out, a clipboard in hand. Natalie stood too quickly, her pulse thudding in her ears. The woman exhaled, glancing between them before speaking. "The blood is a match," she said. "It belongs to Ethan Carter." Jack let out a slow breath. Ray muttered something under his breath, rubbing at his temple. Natalie just stood there. It was real. Ethan was dead. She had known it the moment she saw the fabric, but hearing it confirmed, it felt like a blow to the chest. Her throat burned, but she forced herself to stay standing. "We need to take this to the sheriff." Jack nodded. No more delays, no more silence. Sheriff Tom Harris leaned forward, hands clasped on his desk. His office was small, cluttered, a stark contrast to the man himself, who looked like he barely fit behind the desk. He listened without interrupting as Jack laid out the facts, sliding the forensic report across the wood. The sheriff glanced at it, then at them. "You sure about this?" His voice was quiet, measured. Jack scoffed. "Did you even read the damn report?" Harris ignored him, his sharp gaze settling on Natalie. She met his stare head-on, steady, unwavering. "We have Ethan's blood," she said, her voice cold. "In the woods where he disappeared. You tell me if that's enough." Harris exhaled, leaning back. He tapped his fingers against the desk for a long moment before finally speaking. "I'll reopen the case." Natalie's hands curled into fists at her sides. A mix of relief and rage burned through her. It had taken 27 years for someone in this town to say those words. Jack exhaled through his nose, arms crossed. "And Daniel Brooks?" Harris's jaw ticked. "We'll find him." Natalie nodded, but something deep in her gut told her. Daniel Brooks wasn't going to be easy to catch. Jack had always been good at finding people who didn't want to be found. It was a skill that had kept him in the business longer than he should have been, even after the town had buried him and his career. And now, as he sat hunched over his laptop in his cramped motel room, cigarette smoldering in the ashtray beside him, he felt the old instincts kick in. "Got something," he muttered. Natalie, sitting cross-legged on the bed, looked up sharply. "Where?" Jack exhaled through his nose. "Daniel Brooks is using a different name, David Lawn. Been living off the grid in some backwoods town in Kentucky." He turned the screen toward her, showing a grainy DMV photo. "Not much, but it's enough." Ray, who had been nursing a beer by the window, set it down with a quiet thunk. "That's not exactly next door." Jack shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We go now." Natalie stood. "Then let's go." Ray groaned, rubbing his face. "Jesus, you two are the most impatient people I've ever met." Jack smirked. "Coming from a guy who sat on a crime for 27 years? Ray shot him a glare. "You still got that black eye? 'Cause I can fix the other one." Natalie wasn't listening. She was already grabbing her coat. They didn't wait for the police. The drive to Kentucky was long and uneasy, the kind of silence that made you feel the weight of everything left unsaid. Ray drove, his hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly. Jack was in the passenger seat, flipping through old notes, checking maps, making calls to his last few contacts. Natalie sat in the back, staring out at the endless stretch of highway, her fingers curled around the photo of Ethan. She had spent years wondering if he had been scared, if he had cried out for her, if, in those last moments, he had believed she would come for him. And now, the man who had taken him, who had stolen every future Ethan was supposed to have, was just a few hours away. She swallowed the lump in her throat and gripped the photo tighter. Not much longer now. They reached the town just before dusk, parking a few blocks away from the trailer park where Daniel had been living. Jack handed Natalie a pair of binoculars. "Spot him before we move." She pressed them to her eyes, scanning the row of rusted trailers, their windows boarded up or covered with sheets. Then, movement. A man stepped onto a sagging porch, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. Daniel Brooks. Natalie's stomach twisted. He was thinner than she remembered from old mugshots, his once broad shoulders now hunched, his face lined with age and something else. Paranoia. "He knows someone's coming," Jack muttered, watching him. "Look at him. He's nervous." Ray nodded. "Guilt does that." They waited, the minutes stretching long and unbearable. No police yet. Jack's fingers twitched at his side. Something's wrong. They should be here by now. Natalie's heart pounded. What if he runs? As if in answer, Daniel suddenly froze, his body going rigid. And then he turned, his eyes locked onto them. Natalie felt it like a shock to the spine. Daniel's face twisted, recognition dawning like a slow, creeping horror. Then, without hesitation, he bolted. Shit! Jack was already moving, throwing open the car door. Daniel lunged off the porch, sprinting toward the tree line at the edge of the trailer park. Ray cursed, fumbling for the ignition. But before anyone could react, the sirens came. Bright, blinding blue and red lights flooded the street, tires screeching against pavement as squad cars swarmed the lot. Daniel skidded to a stop. Trapped, officers spilled out, guns drawn. Hands where we can see them! For a moment, it looked like Daniel might run anyway, might throw himself into the trees, into the unknown. But then, his shoulders sagged. Slowly, he raised his hands. An officer tackled him to the ground, knees pressing into his back. He yelled something, but Natalie couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. She stepped forward, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Daniel looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes. Not anger, not defiance, shame, or maybe it was fear. He looked away before she could tell which. As they hauled him into the back of the squad car, Natalie exhaled. This wasn't over, but it was finally beginning. The interrogation room smelled of stale sweat and desperation. Daniel Brooks sat hunched over the metal table, hands cuffed, fingers twitching, his knee bouncing under the table. The overhead light was harsh, casting sharp shadows that made the hollows of his face even deeper. For the first hour, he had said nothing. Tom Harris leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, his voice level. "You know why you're here, Daniel." Daniel exhaled through his nose, staring at the scuffed surface in front of him. Ray, standing near the door, folded his arms. "This is your chance. You don't talk now. It's only going to get worse." Nothing. Jack stood behind the two-way mirror, watching. His notepad was open, but he hadn't written a single word. Natalie stood beside him, arms crossed so tightly it was a wonder she hadn't cut off circulation. Daniel looked different now, stripped of his escape, stripped of the shadows he had hidden in for decades. There was no trailer to run to, no brother to cover for him. Just the truth. And the truth was waiting. Tom sighed, sliding something across the table. Ethan's torn shirt. Daniel's whole body went rigid. The blood had long since dried, the fabric stiff and brittle, but it still carried weight, the undeniable, inescapable weight of what had been done. His breath hitched, and for the first time since being dragged into the room, he looked up. His face was tight, his eyes darting to the shirt, then to Tom, then to Ray, as if measuring the space, calculating his options. But there were none. Ray's voice was quiet. "We found him, Daniel." A beat of silence. Then, a crack in the dam. Daniel swallowed hard, his shoulders caving inward. His knee stopped bouncing, his fingers curled inward, knuckles whitening. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said it. "I didn't mean to kill him." Natalie's breath caught. Jack finally moved, flipping open his notebook, the pen scratching against the paper. Tom's expression didn't change. "Start talking." Daniel's hands trembled as he ran them through his graying hair. "I was in debt," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, thick with something between exhaustion and fear. "Owed money to the wrong people. Couldn't pay it back." He exhaled shakily, pressing his palms to his face. "I needed a way out. Fast." Tom's voice was careful. "What did you do, Daniel?" Daniel winced, as if the weight of the words had already broken him. He opened his mouth, closed it, then started again. "There was a guy," he rasped. "A contact through the gambling circuit. Told me there were Buyers. His hands clenched into fists. People who paid a lot for kids. The room stilled. Natalie's nails dug into her arms. Her stomach lurched. Daniel let out a shuddering breath. I wasn't going to hurt them. I just needed money. Needed a way out. Ray's voice was like gravel. You kidnapped 3 boys. Daniel's face twisted. They weren't supposed to fight back. Jack let out a slow, measured breath from the other side of the glass. Daniel's voice cracked. Ethan, he wasn't supposed to... He shook his head violently, as if trying to shake the memory away. He panicked. He fought harder than the others. His voice faltered. Natalie's vision blurred with hot, uncontrollable rage. I had a sedative, Daniel continued. Wasn't supposed to kill him. Just knock them out long enough to get them where they needed to go. His fingers dug into his scalp, his face contorted in something ugly. But Ethan, he swallowed thickly. He had a weak heart. Natalie's stomach plummeted. She had known about Ethan's heart condition and had grown up watching her parents monitor him, take extra precautions, and keep him from overexerting himself. He had never stood a chance. Daniel let out a choked sound. He stopped breathing. His face twisted, eyes red. I didn't know what to do. Ray's voice was tight. So you called your brother? Daniel let out a bitter, broken laugh. I didn't have a choice. Tom's expression didn't change. What did he say? Daniel swallowed. Told me to get rid of the body. Silence. Jack's pen scratched across the page, recording every damning word. Daniel let out another hollow breath. Tommy and Lucas were still out cold. He told me to go through with the deal. His voice wavered. So I did. The temperature in the room dropped. Tom's jaw clenched. You sold 2 kids. Daniel didn't respond, because there was nothing to say. Natalie couldn't breathe. This was it. This was the moment that had haunted her for 27 years. Ethan had died in the back of a stranger's car, alone, terrified, and drugged. And Tommy and Lucas, their fates had been even worse. Natalie's chest tightened. The walls were too close. She turned sharply, pushing through the door, the weight of it crashing over her. The hallway was dim and empty, but she could still hear him, his voice, his excuses, his pathetic rationalizations. She wanted to tear the walls down, to burn everything to the ground. Jack came after her, his footsteps quick but careful. Natalie. She whirled around, eyes blazing. I need to see him. Jack exhaled through his nose. That's a bad idea. I don't care. Jack hesitated, then nodded once. All right. She turned back toward the door, hands curled into fists. But before she could move, an officer came rushing down the hall, his face pale. Sheriff Harris. The man's breath was uneven. It's Brooks. Tom turned from the interrogation room, eyes narrowing. What about him? The officer swallowed hard. William Brooks is missing. William Brooks had disappeared before the ink on Daniel's confession was even dry. By the time the police stormed his house, it was empty. The front door was unlocked, the floors covered in footprints from officers moving in and out. His wallet, keys and phone were still on the kitchen counter, but his gun and a duffel bag were gone. Sheriff Tom Harris stood in the middle of the house, his hands on his hips, surveying the scene with a grim expression. He didn't run, Harris muttered, shaking his head. He's hiding. Jack, leaning against the doorway, flipped through his notes. Or planning something. Natalie stood in the corner, arms crossed, her nails digging into her palms. She wasn't sure which was worse. The town turned on itself overnight. Rumors spread fast. Some people refusing to believe that William Brooks had covered up a child's murder, others claiming they had always known something was off. By morning, a warrant was issued for his arrest, but William had always been one step ahead. The house was wiped clean. No laptop, no files, no handwritten notes. The only thing left behind was a family portrait from 2 decades ago, still hanging above the fireplace. A man who wanted to disappear wouldn't have left something like that, which meant he was still close. Natalie didn't care where he was, not yet. Natalie had never seen the town like this before. For years, Sturgeon had been a place of silence, of unspoken grief and buried truths. But now, it was cracking open, its long-held secrets spilling into the streets. The morning after Daniel's confession, the news had spread like wildfire. The people of Sturgeon had lived with this mystery for 27 years, whispering theories behind closed doors, lowering their voices whenever the Carter name was spoken. But now, there was no need for whispers. The truth had been dragged into the daylight, raw and undeniable. William Brooks, the man so many had trusted, had been protecting his brother. And now, he was gone. Some believed it was proof of his guilt. Others, clinging desperately to the past, insisted there had to be a mistake. But no one could deny what had happened to Ethan. And for the first time since that awful summer in 1995, the town was grieving with her. When Natalie woke that morning, the first thing she saw was the basket on her doorstep. It wasn't the only one. As she stepped onto the porch, her breath caught in her throat. Flowers, still damp with morning dew, had been placed carefully near the front steps. A small bundle of apples sat beside a carton of eggs, the kind wrapped in newspaper from someone's backyard coop. Someone had left a loaf of fresh bread, still warm. There were no notes, no names, just quiet offerings, acts of care that needed no explanation. Her fingers trembled as she picked up an apple, turning it over in her hands. These people had nothing to do with Ethan's death, but they had carried the weight of his absence too. For years, they had lowered their eyes, stepped around the subject, and buried their suspicions. But now, they were here, not with apologies, but with kindness. Her throat burned as she set the apple back down, blinking against the weight pressing against her chest. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything at all. Jack stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching her carefully. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After a long moment, Natalie exhaled, stepping back inside. "We need to go." Jack nodded. "Yeah." They still had work to do. The graveyard was silent when they arrived, the morning sun casting long shadows over the uneven ground. Natalie hesitated before stepping forward. Ethan's grave had always been a hollow thing, a headstone without a body, a monument to uncertainty. But now, it was a grave. Her legs felt heavy as she walked, the grass cool beneath her steps. She stood before it, her fingers curling into fists. She had imagined this moment for so many years. She had dreamed of standing here with answers, of telling Ethan that she had finally found the truth. But now that she was here, she didn't know what to say. Jack and Ray stood behind her, their presence steady but unintrusive. She swallowed against the lump in her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found you." Her breath shuddered. "I should have done it sooner." Her hands trembled as she reached out, tracing his name on the cold stone, a name that had become a ghost. "You waited for so long," she whispered, "and I left you here." Her chest ached, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. Jack shifted beside her. "You didn't leave him." Natalie exhaled sharply, closing her eyes. For years, she had blamed herself, for leaving town, for moving on, for surviving. But Ethan had never been forgotten, not by her, not by her parents, not by the town that had, in its own broken way, mourned him. Her voice was steadier when she spoke again. "We have Ethan's truth." She turned, meeting Jack's gaze. "But we still don't have Tommy or Lucas." Jack nodded, grim determination settling into his features. "Then that's where we go next." Ray let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. "You two don't know how to quit, do you?" Natalie almost smiled. "No," Ray huffed, shaking his head. "All right, then let's find the bastards who took them." As they walked back toward the car, a strange feeling settled in Natalie's chest, like something was watching. She stopped. Her gaze drifted beyond the iron fence, past the rows of headstones, and then she saw it. A car, dark, unmoving, waiting. A shadow behind the wheel, watching from a distance. Her stomach tightened, and then, as if sensing her attention, the engine hummed to life. The car rolled away, disappearing down the road. Natalie exhaled, her pulse pounding. Jack followed her gaze. "Think that was him?" Natalie didn't answer, because she already knew. William Brooks was still out there, and he wasn't finished running. The town of Sturgeon was waking up, but it was not the same town it had been before. The truth had cracked something open, and now there was no closing it back up. For years, people had kept their heads down, avoided the Carter family's tragedy like an uncomfortable stain they didn't know how to clean. But with William Brooks on the run, no one could pretend anymore. The morning was grey and quiet, the weight of revelation still settling over Sturgeon like a fog. But there was movement. For the first time in 27 years, people were talking, not in hushed whispers, not in avoidance, in reckoning. Natalie barely slept. Her mind was a storm of memories and possibilities, of the past she had uncovered and the future she had to chase. By dawn, she was already at Jack's motel room, knocking sharply. The door opened to reveal Jack, half awake, coffee in hand, notes scattered across the desk behind him. "You're early," he muttered, stepping aside to let her in. "We don't have time to waste," she said. Jack took a slow sip of coffee. "Figured." Ray showed up not long after, grumbling about needing a damn break, but not meaning it. The three of them sat in the cramped motel room, the air thick with exhaustion and something heavier, determination. "We need to find Tommy and Lucas," Natalie said, the words firm. Jack nodded, flipping through a worn notebook. "I started digging through missing children reports from the Midwest in the late 90s. Some cases match the timeline." Ray leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And Daniel's buyers?" Jack exhaled through his nose. It wasn't just local. The ring stretched across state lines. Some of it even reached Mexico and Canada. Natalie's stomach turned. "They could be anywhere," she murmured. Jack looked up, his expression sharp. "Then we start everywhere." The town, though shaken, began to act. People who had been silent for years now spoke. Natalie had never imagined this. Families, neighbors, strangers, all coming together. Parents of other missing children, once isolated in their grief, now found each other. What began as hushed conversations over coffee turned into gatherings, support networks, a movement. Natalie sat in a small church hall, watching as dozens of faces filled the room, faces of loss, faces of quiet strength. A woman, older, with tired eyes and a weathered face, held up a photo of her son, missing since 1997. A man near the back clutched a worn flyer. His sister had vanished in 2001. They weren't just searching for Tommy and Lucas anymore. They were searching for all of them. Natalie felt it then, truly felt it. This wasn't just her fight. It never had been. Jack's article broke 3 months later. It was everywhere. The Brooks cover-up, the trafficking ring, the failures of the town's justice system, all laid bare in print. It reignited national attention, pulling in investigators, reporters, the kind of pressure that forced action. Natalie sat at her kitchen table, a newspaper spread in front of her, Jack's byline bold across the page. It felt surreal, but it wasn't over. Not even close. And then, the calls started coming in, from social workers who had seen faces that seemed too familiar, from truck stop employees who had memories of scared kids passing through, from foster parents, ex-cops, people who had spent years wondering if the child they once saw had ever made it home. Some were dead ends, some were not. Jack's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, and his face changed. When he hung up, his voice was quiet, but electric, with something dangerous and sharp. "We've got a lead." Natalie exhaled slowly, and then she stood. "Then we go." If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.